Tourism and travel are the lifeblood of the Nevada economy, and we know tourism is being impacted by recent national and global political changes. So today's discussion will provide key insights into how tourism and travel here in Las Vegas is performing and how those factors play a role in shaping Nevada's economic landscape. Attendees will also have the opportunity to participate in a live Q&A following today's presentation. We are honored to welcome a distinguished expert to lead today's conversation. Introducing our speakers, Jeremy Aguero, Principal Analyst at Applied Analyst, is one of Nevada's leading voices on economic trends, data analysis, and public policy. Today's session will be moderated by Mary Beth Sewald, President and CEO of the Vegas Chamber, and Hugh Anderson, Chair of the Vegas Chamber's Government Affairs Committee. Together, they'll help guide the conversation and audience Q&A as we explore what current trends mean for the future of Nevada's economy. To begin, please welcome Vegas Chamber President and CEO, Mary Beth Sewald, for opening remarks.
All right. Thank you so much, Jasmine. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today on today's Situation Report webinar, which is sponsored by Brownstein Law Firm. So a huge thank you to our friends at Brownstein for helping make this series possible. You know, at the Vegas Chamber, we're committed to equipping our members with timely data and insights and resources so that you can make the decisions, so that you can be informed to make the decisions that you need to make. There are a lot of things changing like every minute or so. We were just talking about that. So we created at the Vegas Chamber this bi-weekly webinar to help inform you all so that everybody can make more informed decisions about our business. Because like we always say, if, in the absence of the accurate information, some people kind of make things up as we go, and we don't want that. So we call this webinar series the Situation Report, Navigating the Now, and we hope you find these reports valuable. All right. Before we start, really quickly, I want to highlight just a couple of very important chamber events that will give you a valuable opportunity to stay engaged with policymakers and business leaders. So we invite you to join us in celebrating our servicemen and servicewomen at this year's MAC Night Out. That's our Military Affairs Committee, MAC Night Out. It's Wednesday, May 7th. Mark your calendars, please. We hope you'll join us for this really meaningful event. I promise you will not regret attending that. Also, the Vegas Chamber's end of legislative session and breakfast will be held on June 18th. That's June 18th for the end of legislative session breakfast. I think most of us are looking forward to that. Read into that what you will. And right now, everybody, thanks again for joining us, but I would like to introduce and hand it over to the Managing Director of Hightower, Las Vegas, and the Chairman of the Chamber's Government Affairs Committee, Mr. Hugh Anderson. Good morning, Hugh.
Good morning, Mary Beth. Thank you so much for including me in this presentation, because I think it's vital for our members to fill the vacuum of information that they may be lacking, and more importantly, to help us navigate the noise. We all deal with, at the Chamber as well as in my practice, a lot of small businesses who just are struggling to get their navigational compass to work in this environment, because, as you said, it's changing so rapidly. So without wasting too much time, because Jeremy Aguero is going to be our navigator. He's going to be the captain of this ship to help us understand what's true, what's not true, and more importantly, to look at facts. Jeremy, thanks for being here, and we appreciate you making time for us and our members.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate the kind introduction, and I'm happy to be here. As I was talking to Mary Beth about what to sort of talk through here, there's just so many questions that are out there today. And so I will be perfectly honest, I have prepared wildly too much for today's presentation, a couple hundred slides. We're not even trying to go through all those, but I'd like to just touch on some key topics. And perhaps I should begin at the end, right? There is so much that is going on right now that people are kind of reacting to what is in the media, what is sort of a lot of hyperbole around the potential implications of policies and policy changes and things like tariffs. And there's no doubt that there are some pretty significant implications associated with what might be possible. But as I think we've talked about a great deal over the past few days, the past few weeks, the universe of things that we don't know is so much greater than the universe things that we do know. And so much of the reaction is based on what could potentially happen as opposed to what is actually happening today. And so I think, dialing back a bit of the hyperbole and sort of focusing more on some of the facts and fundamentals associated with our economy might be helpful in today's world. And as we look at it today, the United States, in terms of productivity, in terms of employment, in terms of what consumers are actually spending today, remains relatively robust, respecting the fact that there are clouds that loom on the horizon in terms of both individual consumers as well as businesses, I think, are dealing with the uncertainty of the economy. That's certainly true today. It's not as though our economy has sort of shown signs of sort of imminent demise, which has been suggested. Things like, hey, we're heading into a, economic nuclear winter. I don't think that is true at all. So with that, let me perhaps share my screen and then talk through a few and let me pull up. I actually have multiple presentations that are here, but I'll pull this one up for the time being. Let's see. Share my screen and we can kind of go from here. Oops. There we go. So let me just sort of hit on a few of the sort of highlights from here. And I'd like to start by, I'm going to just jump through sort of the world for a moment. And I'd like to just start with this slide, which looks at consumer confidence, right? And from a consumer confidence, let me see if I can make this guy just a little smaller here. There we go. If we look at consumer confidence has a tendency to be broken into two major component parts. One of those is, are you better off today than you were a year ago? And the other is, how do you feel about where you're headed going in to this next year, next 6 months? You're going to make expenditures. You're going to do some of the things you were before. The consumer confidence has sort of dropped significantly, and I think that has folks a little bit concerned relative to where things are. As a matter of fact, consumer confidence is the lowest we've seen in about a decade. In terms of expectations, people are sort of concerned that we're kind of heading down this road. And when consumers make up a great deal of economic activity and through spending, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, that has a tendency to make folks feel a bit unsettled relative to that overall. And what does that unsettling look like? Difficult to predict inflation, difficult to understand job activity. Do you plan to buy a car? Do you plan to buy a home? What we know is that consumers are reacting to the news that are out there today, and that creates this sort of circumstance where, at least in some ways, we're talking ourselves into an economic downturn. Recessions happen, as we were talking about before this webinar began. Economies grow for very similar reasons. They decline for very different ones. Now we know that long before we started talking about tariffs, or we started talking about change in administration or any of those type of things, that the economy was showing some signs of weakness. In addition to that, if we look at the stock market performance, and probably more importantly, the second sort of set of slides that I wanted to look at were largely the savings rate. And what we've actually seen is consumers doing something that's kind of odd in today's world. After the savings rate decreasing and decreasing and decreasing for the better part of really the past year plus, the savings rate is starting to come back up. And this is a clear indication of consumers just being uncertain. They just don't know what to expect today. And so they're starting to save a little bit more. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about interest rates, but I did want to spend a moment talking about the excess savings that consumers have, because I'd like to talk about the wealth distribution as we continue to go through, and the distribution that exists beyond this, because this is the savings, and this is really excess savings. So this is savings that people added up beyond traditional savings, really during most of the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can see that excess savings was largely attributable to the wealthiest consumers in the United States, although we had tremendous savings that occurred for those consumers that are at in the top 90% as opposed to not the top 10%. And you can kind of see where that was through 2022. Those numbers have dramatically changed as we got to the end of 2024. While the wealthier consumers have a tendency to still be at the top end of the spectrum and has maintained a large amount of the amount of wealth that was sort of accumulated during COVID-19, the bottom 90% of consumers have burned through the majority of that excess savings. And this is why we're starting to see pressure. And again, this is pressure before the new administration. This pressure existed before, and this is pressure that I think we've been expecting to see for a long, long time relative to the economy finding a resettling after COVID-19. This is not unusual. This is nothing to sort of write home about, but it is a resetting of the economy in sort of a post-COVID bounce back environment. Now, we can look through economic indicators, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but I do want to, I'm just going to hit escape here, so you're going to bear with me for a moment so I can just scroll down to another set of slides here relative to the things that I wanted to just touch base on. These are all the things on executive orders, but I do want to spend just a little bit of time on tariffs, right? Because this seems to be the thing that have people just screaming and yelling and sort of losing their minds relative to tariffs. There's no doubt the tariffs have come up, that there's all kinds of articles around the tariffs, but I'd like just to spend a moment thinking about tariffs as a percentage of GDP, because there's all of this rhetoric around the fact that, you know, sort of China and other countries can somehow weather some of this, but the United States cannot. And if we look at share of GDP and trade reliance, even though there is a trade imbalance, the United States is relatively well positioned relative to this. Now, that doesn't mean to suggest for a moment that China may not be able to weather some of the trade war better than the United States can. I don't know that I can make commentary relative to that. But at the end of the day, if we look at some of the trade and we look at its relative percentage in terms of this, the United States, in terms of its GDP, you know, is not that poorly positioned. And if we look at relative trade reliance on Chinese exports or U.S. imports or Canadian or Mexican activity, it is not nearly the level of imbalance, although the trade imbalance does exist. It's not the level of reliance. And I think perhaps most notably, if we look at it in terms of the state of Nevada relative to it, and I'm not going to go through each one of these here, but I wanted to spend a moment on this slide, which is Nevada and its dependence on imports, right? This is Nevada's aggregate economic activity, gross domestic product, just for our state. You could think about it as gross regional product in some ways, but our economy is $262 billion in size. I'd like to show you the portion in terms of imports and what they sort of mean to us from an economic activity standpoint. And this is international imports for purposes of that. $18.8 billion for the state of Nevada, representing about 7.2% of our aggregate economic activity. Now, that is not insignificant. That is not something that we should essentially discount, but it is not the level that folks would somehow suggest that, you know, we are heading into this sort of sharp decline from an economic standpoint. And if we look at our imported trade as a percentage from Canada, Mexico, and China collectively is less than 50% of that aggregate total and has been declining from the peak that we saw in 2016. So again, I don't believe necessarily that the economy is sort of in a position that we are sort of heading into this nuclear winter. It matters, and it matters significantly to us, to our tourism-based economy, and to our economy overall. And there's no doubt that supply shocks associated with reactions to tariffs could somehow be difficult. And tariffs do have ripple effects throughout economies that with the potential of slowing trade overall or slowing economic growth overall, as well as putting upward pressure on prices. Both of those would be bad for us here in Southern Nevada. But the idea that somehow we are reliant on trade with China or Mexico or Canada or anybody else, for that matter, to a level that would be that devastating simply is not true, and something that we ought to be pretty cautious about suggesting is true. The other one that I wanted to spend at least a little bit of time on is really talking about consumers and consumer spending and what we're seeing relative to that. So I'm going to jump down here to slide 59, which shows where we are relative to consumer spending. I think it's important to note that even with all of this pressure, the consumer spending is still at the highest level it has been in United States history. It did come down just slightly in the last month. Okay, we would expect consumers to pull back given what we've looked at in terms of consumer confidence. But when we look at the economy and its relative importance, it continues to be relatively strong overall. But when we look at the underpinnings of that, I think that there are some elements relative to things like net worth in terms of what we're seeing, in terms of aggregate sort of wealth building that we've seen during the past few years. There is no doubt that both the top 10% of consumers as well as the sort of middle set of consumers, 50% to 90%, are declining. But if we look at it and we sort of look at it in terms of the wealth distribution by assets, I do think that there are some things that we ought to be somewhat concerned about. And consumers are continuing to spend. That's great. But let's look at the distribution of assets in the United States today. The top 1% shown on the left, the bottom 50% shown on the right. And this is who owns the assets, if you will, right? So if we look at that and we look at equities, for example, the top 1% of consumers own substantially more than the bottom 50% of consumers in aggregate. And again, I've just sort of carved these out to sort of make the point. But as things like the stock market have improved, again, there's been some distribution in terms of where that is. In addition, when we look at some of the instability that we've seen recently, again, I think much of that has been overblown, but you get an idea. And if we look at it on the opposite side and we look at the liabilities on households, right? We look at how those kind of play out, you'll see that home mortgages here, right? The bottom 50% own a great deal of the home mortgages, where the top 1% of consumers have a tendency to essentially not have those nearly at the level of the liabilities that we see. And if we look at it perhaps more importantly in terms of consumer credit relative to that, overall, that borrowing that we're seeing by consumers is going up substantially more in the bottom 50% of consumers and essentially creating some compression. In the fourth quarter of 2024, we saw the delinquencies on credit cards go up to 3%, a level that we have not seen in since pre-pandemic period, and obviously that has us somewhat concerned. If we look at household debt composition, and you know, a lot has been made about student loans and them needing to be paid back. I think that they ought to be paid back, but if you look at student loans, that's that sort of yellowish sort of area that's resolved there. But you can see that things like home mortgages, auto loans make up a fair share of what's out there overall. You can also see that household debt is at the highest level that it's been in United States history, and so from that perspective, something to keep a very close eye on. When I had my staff sort of look at this and sort of do the comparison between the two, you can kind of get a sense of where we've really seen the growth between 03 and 2024. There's no doubt that the debt has been going up, something we've been doing for a long time. And frankly, consumers are doing the same thing that our government is doing. They are spending to continue to consume. And that's a conversation probably that we'll have for a great deal of time. But when you think about what we just looked at in terms of household balance sheets overall, as these interest rates go up, it puts pressure not on the wealthiest consumers, but on everyone else relative to that. And, you know, certainly things like the fact that student loans are up 563% from where they were in 2003 ought to be concerning, but the overall balance here is what the real problem is. I talked about these consumers overall. I also like to think about it in this perspective, and I won't spend a whole lot of time here because our time is brief, but if we look at the intent to splurge, which by the way has dramatically benefited Las Vegas in terms of spending profile, right? As Mary Beth was mentioned in the opening, we know that visitor volume has increased and the spending has increased immensely. But if we look at the intent to splurge over the next 3 months, it's very different between what we'd see with older consumers versus younger consumers overall. And this is a presentation for another day, but 6 in 10 Gen Zs tend to treat themselves, which would ostensibly be good for Las Vegas. But if we look at the intent to splurge, what does it mean for different groups? Where baby boomers are looking at pulling back, their intent to splurge is largely on things like travel. And you can see the gray areas represent all consumers. The black areas represent the specific consumer segment in terms of what's in there. You look at Gen Z or Gen X, excuse me, then you look at millennials. Millennials, they're highlighting areas like apparel, footwear, home electronics, jewelry. And if we look at Gen Z, their concept of splurging is just different. It's more along the lines of things like, you know, entertainment at home or beauty and personal care, which you would expect of younger generations overall. we look at all this and we look at where consumers plan to spend less on within the next 3 months. As those consumers deal with that uncertainty, the areas where they're expecting to spend less money are ones that hit at the direct heart of our economy. Things like hotels, international flights, travel, and those type of things, which means we ought to keep a pretty close eye on this. And when we see the declines that we had in visitor volume last month, these things are coming to fruition. And certainly we know anecdotally that folks from Canada are perhaps less apt to take flights into the United States, making something of a political statement overall, which is impacting us. The last one that I would like to hit on, and again, I've prepared way too much, but if there's things we want to touch base on, I'm happy to do it, is really the legislative session. So let me just come right here for a moment and we'll talk about, I'll just come to this guy. When we think about the legislative session and what is happening up at the legislative session, there are things that are both good and bad. But I think that overall, as we start to hurl toward the end game at the legislative session, where the concentration is sort of seems really important to me. At the point that I had pulled this presentation together, there were 1,087 bills that had been introduced. And we're not going to try to go through all of those bills or something along those lines, but health and healthcare is 380 of those bills overall. And education is another 359 of those bills. Business, which I think is probably more important to the chamber. Well, these are all business bills, I suppose, in one way or another, are 227 of those bills, right? The legislative session has about 30 days left, 32 days left, something along those lines before it comes to an end. And I think as all of these things start to come together, the majority leader's education bill came out a couple of days ago. I believe the governor's economic development bill came out yesterday or the day before yesterday, and really setting the tone for some major policy discussions that are going to take place. At the beginning of the legislative session, it was a lot about, in my career, I've never seen so many, 3 and 4 page bills. It was a lot of things to sort of attack areas that legislators felt were particularly acute relative to needing attention. And now we're starting to see some of the broader bills that are coming out. Again, governor's housing bill and criminal justice bill and economic development bills out, as well as the majority leader's education bill, governor's education bill, and healthcare bill are both still forthcoming. And I think these, perhaps in their broadness and level of attention that the legislature is getting, is that they're really listening and have their radio tuned in to what the concerns are of the people in the state of Nevada. Whether those solutions are the right solutions or wrong solutions, I'm not here to make political commentary relative to that, but there's no doubt that these are highly concentrated on areas that I think the vast majority of people would agree are ones that require attention in the state of Nevada. Mary Beth, I have certainly gone past my 15-minute sort of overview, and I apologize for going a little bit long there. But in terms of some of the things that we're keeping a close eye on, those are them. And I'm happy to sort of pause and jump into anything that the group may have as a question, or you may want me to concentrate on a little bit more.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Go ahead, Hugh.
While we're waiting for the questions to come in, Jeremy, let's start with for the people who spend 110% of their time meeting payroll and focused on their businesses, what 1 or 2 or 3 data points should they be looking at to be kind of the antidote to all the noise and flotsam and jetsam that gets thrown at them all day long? Because I think the underlying theme you just shared with us is, gang, it's not as bad as it sounds.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting thing to me, right? That we're dealing with this type of economic downturn in a social media environment. And never have so many people that have been so uninformed, had so many opinions, and had a platform upon which they can deliver them. And I would tell the same thing to the business owners that are here that I tell to my children that are young and I think unsettled by what they're seeing, that economies go up and they come down, and this is the natural spring of things, right? I mean, my kids, and I mentioned, I assume many of the people here, I wrote an article recently just talking about all of these economic downturns, right? You'll remember when, people said that, because we got rid of the gold standard, it was going to be the end of equities. Or we all remember, right, that when the Y2K was going to end the economy altogether, COVID was going to be the asteroid that ended all asteroids, right? I mean, Y2K, you had these people that were building bunkers and woke up on January 1st with 200 pounds of beans and no apocalypse, right? And we're probably extremely disappointed, right? And I think that now we're in this event where all of these things are happening, right? Our economy is strong. And I think as much as anything else that we have demonstrated in this community, and I believe in this country more than anything else, is that our entrepreneurs in particular are so incredibly resilient and resourceful. Bring it. If this is what you want to throw at us next, as I said before, economies grow for very similar reasons. They decline for very different ones, right? We have been through September 11th, right? And when planes stopped flying and our economy was going to shut down. We went through the Great Recession when the foreclosures were going to be, we were ground zero for the foreclosure crisis, and that was terrible. The Great Recession, which was great for a lot of reasons, I think. We went through a pandemic in which we shut down and all of us celebrated that, and celebrate is a terrible word to use there, but we all did something that I don't know that any of us did, and that is jump on a bike and ride down Las Vegas Boulevard when you just said, it was so eerie and all that. And yet here we are today in arguably one of the most incredible economies across the board. And I would suggest to you, Hugh, that is all incredibly dependent upon the resourcefulness of entrepreneurs who find ways to make it work during remarkably difficult times. And I would say at the end, ignore the noise. Find the opportunity, right? React to the things that you have to react to. And I think as entrepreneurs should always do, right? Hope for the best, expect for the worst, and bring the fire trucks up to the front. We need to be thinking about how we do it if things get a little bit difficult and what the alternatives look like. But, yes, I'm an entrepreneur. I know you are too, in terms of being able to do that. And I think we all worry about our businesses. We worry about them all the time. But the idea that this is going to be the thing that ends us seems to me to be just as ridiculous as when I prepared a presentation for the chamber, I don't know what it was, 10 years ago, when we were talking about the fact that the Mayan calendar was going to end and we were all going to wake up tomorrow. I mean, that is just absolutely a ridiculous thing. It's like our pastime is waiting for the end of the world. And it just seems it is as ridiculous now as it was at any point in time then.
Thank you, Jeremy. The Mayan calendar presentation was a little before my time, so I'm sorry I don't remember that, but sounds like it was.
I do.
You do?
I do very well.
Hey, Jeremy, I sit on the LVCVA board, and I had the pleasure of hearing a presentation from you a couple of weeks ago about tourism visitor volume. You mentioned it just now a little bit. It declined a little bit last month, and since the pandemic, we've struggled with international tourism a little bit. Domestic bounced back real quick, or fairly quickly. And how would you say that tourism, obviously it impacts our small businesses. What's the main point, the takeaway that you would give to our audience today?
Well, look, I am concerned. First of all, I think what the LVCVA and their resort partners have done relative to tourism and having it be constantly reinvented is unbelievable, right? In a post-pandemic environment, the positioning of our tourism industry has been incredible. And we have benefited tremendously from that. And this is not just the fact of we've had major events, the Super Bowl, Formula One, which have driven incredible amounts of gaming revenue and visitor volume in many important ways. And we have other of those events that are coming up. But the convention calendar has shown signs of recovery when people thought that it wouldn't, and some of those type of things, which I think is pretty great. I am concerned in terms of a sustainability standpoint. Mary Beth, excuse me. I'm concerned from a sustainability standpoint because I think we've benefited so tremendously from that consumption related activity that we just talked about, right? Consumers are spending more than they have ever spent before in history. And many of them took a vacation and came to Vegas and said, hey, let's go do something here. And we upped our game, right? More restaurants, more retail, more opportunities for you to do things, as diverse as new games on our casino floors to places like Area 15, which I think are remarkably innovative in terms of what they're giving people as an experience when they come to Las Vegas. That's really cool, right? What we're seeing now is that consumer confidence is starting to come down. If that consumer confidence starts to come down, it will have an impact on our tourism industry, which I think we are seeing today. Do I think it's the end of our tourism industry? No, I do not. But I do think that the ripple effect is something that we ought to be aware of, because today we are as dependent upon our tourism industry as any economy in the United States today. We have made remarkable efforts relative to economic diversification, but those efforts have been almost matched by the continued growth of our visitor economy, right? We have an airport that's outsized for what we're doing. We're continuing to see that level of investment. And I suppose if you're going to be on a one-horse if it's going to be a one-horse town, it's pretty good if that one horse is Secretariat, right? And that's what we have today, right? But we are more dependent on our tourism economy than Detroit is or ever was on auto manufacturing, or Nashville is or ever was on the music industry, or something along those lines. The only real comparison to our economy based on its size would be what government is to Washington, D.C. And we could all imagine if somehow government went away. It's not going to do that. So the ripple effect associated with our tourism economy, I think, is incredibly important and has the potential to impact everybody here if there is a slowdown. In addition to that, I think we have this other challenge within our visitor-based economy, and that is we have seen a substantial amount of growth, and that growth has led to things like an unprecedented contract for culinary members, which I think is awesome and exactly what we should have done. But it also means that our ability to adjust is a little different today than maybe it would have been 2 or 3 years ago because of the obligations that our industry has. Now, what has been remarkable is our industry's ability to reposition itself, right? We can position ourselves to provide luxury like nowhere else in the world. We can also, we have the advertisement for $100 steak next to the advertisement for $7.99 steak and eggs, right? I mean, that's pretty cool in terms of our ability to do that. But we have to realize that as we continue to reposition along those lines, that the potential impacts associated with that are real. And our tourism industry is not recession proof. There's no such thing as being recession proof. And so I think its ability to weather that storm. The LVCVA's continued ability, I think, to do 2 things. Number one, drive major events and major convention activity is incredibly important to us. But I also think the ability to work on campaigns that are mindful of the new value position that exists and whether the industry itself has the ability to sort of provide some movement around things that I think there's a lot of chatter out there, really about 2 things that are out there. One is always safety. We're seeing a lot of conversation about safety, homelessness, things like that on the Strip, making sure that it's a wonderful experience for every visitor that comes along those lines, but also recognizing that the value proposition of Las Vegas, people talk about increased cost of parking, higher cost of rooms, higher cost of resort fees, and those type of things. And look, I think that there's genius behind revenue generation from our resort industry, but we're seeing an increased level of chatter along those lines, and our ability to react to that in terms of reminding people that when you come to Vegas, you get value out of every dollar that you put in. It continues to be, I think, paramount, and will be paramount probably over the next couple of years.
I would just,
Jeremy, I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead, Mary Beth. Finish your.
Well, I just wanted to have a follow-up question really quickly, Hugh, and then I'll turn it back over to you. But Jeremy, we talk a lot about diversifying our economy. And yesterday we had an incredible business power luncheon with the new A's president and CEO, Mark Bedane. It was an event like we've never had before, but we know that we've seen a lot of major investments in sports, entertainment, infrastructure across Southern Nevada. How would you say that these developments are kind of impacting our broader economy? We know there's a trickle down in terms of jobs, workforce, and our long-term sustainability. Plus, that provides a lot of opportunity for our smaller businesses to get connected with these major sporting events.
Yeah, look, I mean, right now, Mary Beth, we have about $30 billion statewide in planned, proposed, and under construction projects. There's no doubt that some of those are reevaluating based on existing conditions and waiting to see exactly how things develop. But if you want to talk about the A's coming and putting a $1.75 billion stadium and then likely a resort following along somewhere along those lines to have that level of reinvestment, that's an investment that other communities would give their eye teeth to have. It will generate thousands of jobs, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in wages and salaries, and it will have a ripple effect throughout the totality of our economy. That's why our construction industry is like about 8-9% of our total workforce, which is about twice what it would be otherwise. Those are good, high-paying jobs that stay here in our economy. And so I think when you look at that, I think it matters. In addition to that, I think the fact that the A's are putting their money where their mouth is something that we shouldn't dismiss overall. I think the hiring of Mark Bedane, I think for most of us that know Mark, believe that there is no better person that could have been hired for that position. Not only does he have the knowledge, the community connections, but he's just a tremendous human being that believes in this community and this has made this place his home. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. And having a group that when other folks said, hey, look, I don't know whether the A's can do it. I don't know whether they'll make the investment. I don't know whether they'll put the players on the team. I think we all ought to, the chatter that we heard before about the performance of the A's. I mean, not only that, they've signed contracts and are putting a better product on the field. And I think that they are putting a world-class stadium into construction here for us. That will drive events that we wouldn't otherwise be able to have. And so that will also drive demand for not just employment at that physical facility, but it'll ripple through the totality of our economy. I think it's going to be wonderful for us. Now, again, Mary Beth, some of the other stuff that we've seen. I mean, I get a call probably every other week from somebody who says, I have the inside line on the NBA, or I want to bring Major League Soccer to Las Vegas, right? I love to hear that kind of stuff. But you and I both know, and I think you can probably attest to this, that there's a lot of people that come to this community with a trailer and a dream and say, hey, this is what I'm going to do. Many of those things don't work. But if there's a place where things do work, it is Southern Nevada today, right? And what we are continuing to see is entities thinking, hey, look, am I going to rebuild in California today? Am I going to expand there? No, I don't know that I necessarily am. And I think, what we're going to hear over the next 30 days is a really important one of those. And that is something around these movie studios that people are continuing to talk about. Again, I am not here to make any political commentary whatsoever, but you have a group that is willing to make billions of dollars of investment over the next 15 years. You have Howard Hughes Corporation, which is, ostensibly the greatest developer in the history of the state of Nevada relative to investment, relative to what they've done, saying we're going to back this and go get it done. Now, the legislature will have to evaluate that, and there's a lot of dialogue that has to go around that project. Again, I'm not here to make any commentary, but when you talk about where people want to be, the A's want to be here. They demonstrated that by making that level of investment and by hiring what I think is a world-class president, right? Sony and Warner Brothers Discovery want to be here and are willing to put their money where their mouth is. And they've brought the best developer in our history along there with them. If that's not a signal in terms of what's possible, I don't know what is.
So Jeremy, you talked about the sustainability of Las Vegas's offering to our tourist community. Keep them coming. The LVCVA has done a remarkable job of adapting and evolving. The messaging has been extraordinary, especially as it adapts to the different economic cycles. In your work, have you been able to start seeing, so for instance, let's use the Vegas Golden Knights as an example. They're now almost a decade old, and beyond the glitz and glamour of the games and the T-Mobile Arena and all that so forth, if you walk through their operations center, you see hundreds of people toiling away in the less glamorous jobs, but no less professional nor highly compensated and so forth. So what I contend is that as we brought professional sports to town, we now have created a professional sports industry for people who may not have the physical talent to skate or dunk a basketball, but are in fact doing what you and I do in our chosen profession, but they're doing it in the confines of the sports industry. Are you beginning to see that in your workforce data, that lends itself to supporting the diversification of our workforce.
Yes, I mean, there is no doubt about that. There is no doubt. But the weird thing is, Hugh, that it is also driving our tourism-based economy, right? More than 50% of the butts in seats at Allegiant Stadium are people that are not from Las Vegas, right? Look, I realize Mr. Davis wants that to be nothing but Raiders fans, and I totally agree with him. But when I look at it, all I see is $1,200, $1,200, $1,200 from all these people that are coming to our community and spending that money. And you bring it up from a diversity standpoint, right? It has diversified our economy because the business of sports is beyond game day or beyond race weekend or fight night or anything along those lines. And I think you have to give amazing credit to the folks at the UFC. Right? I mean, they are the ones. We talk about the Golden Knights. They're awesome. We talk about our world champion aces. I think that's awesome. All of those type of things. But you have to give credit to the folks because they redefined the idea that the business of sports can do better here. And Lawrence Epstein, I think, has just taken that to an entirely different level. Mary Beth, if we have just a moment, I gave a presentation not that long ago about the sports economy. I realize it's a little different than what Hugh was talking about, but I want to just show, if I can just show one set of slides from that other presentation, is that all right?
Yeah,
Let me see if I can pull this up. Just if you'll bear with me for just one quick second. I think I can come here, share my screen.
And while Jeremy's pulling that up, Mary Beth, we do have a couple of questions in the queue.
Yeah, we do. We'll get
Let me
to
just
that.
show this really quick. This is who we were, all this stuff about recession. Let me show you this. I love this set of slides that my staff put together. Everybody loves to believe that this just sort of happened overnight, right? So this is the running up the score. This is the pre-1990s in terms of the things that we did, right? Hosting early boxing, the rodeo, all of those type of things. But we also had things that didn't work overall. Right. And I think people sometimes forget that as we go through all the way through the 2010s, that sports was part of us, but it didn't just happen overnight. Right. So this is the 2020s. And then we sort of continue to have it grow. All the things that we were able to do. You want to talk about this community finding a way to get it done. When we look at the wins versus the losses, it's not like everything worked here, but we kept trying and we realized that when you have your event in Las Vegas, it drives value. And Hugh, that is, I think, ultimately the answer to your question is that it's not because sports work here. It's because the business of sports works here better. If you bring your event, you are going to make more money in Las Vegas. And I think that is what so many entrepreneurs understand is that if you provide value, people will follow. Everybody wants to believe that Las Vegas is all about return on investment. I hear it all the time. I get calls every day. Oh, economic impact this and economic impact that and fiscal impact this and fiscal impact that. Those are all really important. We want to drive value, new live entertainment tax, diversity of our economy. But what we care about as a community is return on experience, right? The idea that if your fans have a better opportunity to do that, a better experience while they're here, they will keep coming back. And I'm going to show you one other thing. Mary Beth, please bear with me for just a minute. But the question is one that I think bears asking. So let me just come to this slide down here. Now, these are all the events, a lot of stuff. Where did I put it? I put it down here at the bottom. All of the events that we do, return on experience, this type of thing, fans. I had the one, where is it? Oh, bear with me. Here it is, right here. Watch this, right. NFRA, I couldn't imagine getting to do this at any other place than Las Vegas, right? The excitement that comes with the Super Bowl, everybody has seen him saying, Viva Las Vegas. I won't have that role, right? NHL Players Pool, which is the best atmosphere for the game. Right? What is the best road city for an off day? Right? What is the best road city for an off in 2022 and 2023? Which arena is the toughest place to play as a visitor? Right? I mean, it is stuff like that that is driving that value and meaning that it's a great place for the promoters, a great place for the athletes, a great place for the fans. That is what drives it for us. And if, to Hugh's point, it's a great place to do business. And that is why we're driving that additional value.
Excellent. Mary Beth, you want to start queuing up some of those questions?
Yeah, sure. You touched on this, Jeremy. Questions in the chat. This one comes from Erica Pope. It's about the film bills at the legislature. How are you feeling about the, particularly it says the workforce development and economic diversification aspects? Senate bill with UNLV has investment not only for film, but also education and other creative technology industries.
Yeah, look, I mean, as a jobs bill, there is no doubt it will drive employment, and if from that standpoint, I think that frankly, the bills as currently drafted would arguably be the best film tax credit deal, I think, almost anywhere in the United States. The fact that it has the combination of, at least on one of the bills, has the combination of Sony and Warner Brothers, I think is something that provides instant credibility and instant critical mass, which I think is also important. Obviously, we're always worried about the permanency association with that, right? You don't want folks to come here. If they're going to come, you want them to stay for an extended period of time, just like we have non-relocation agreements for the A's. We have non-relocation agreements for the Raiders, right? We need to have some type of permanency guarantee because I think there is no doubt that jobs get created and they are significant. I think there is no doubt that those jobs diversify our economy, and that is significant, and that will ultimately be a good thing. Now, what Erica also brings up is there are two bills, right? One of those bills has UNLV associated, the university system. The other has, I believe, Nevada Partners as a training center. I think what I would imagine that at some point, should this actually move forward, that those bills will find a way to merge together. And I think having a relationship with the university system is absolutely critical because it is the development of that pipeline of skills. I think in our K through 12, the integration of that could be great. I see a CTE, a Career Technical Academy, CTA, being developed relative around that, which already exists in some ways today. I think the integrations with our world-class Las Vegas Academy, those kids are so incredibly talented. Finding a way for them to apply their skills here seems to me to be remarkably important relative to that. And I from an economic standpoint, I think Erica is absolutely right. If we can find a way to make it work for Nevada, we will have more Nevadans working as a result of it.
Jeremy, do you have are you willing to figure out or give us your opinion on what the economic forum number is going to be today? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I will tell you that our current working number is that the general fund dollars will probably be down about $250 million plus or minus during the next biennium. Hugh, I would guess somewhere between, 70 and 125 million in the current biennium, just based on what we've seen today. That'll have some ripple effects through other areas that are non-general fund dollars. Look, it really depends here. I think, Hugh, it depends on whether they forecast based on what we actually know today, or they forecast based on expectations in an uncertain world where, hey, I've got to deal with tariffs. I will tell you that I think those estimates that I just provided to you, that the plus or minus could be 50% on those, because you just don't know how that's ultimately going to play out. And we also have this other little bit of a challenge, and that is all the data are not in as much as they would usually be when the economic forum. We've got a system changeover, which will ultimately be great for the state of Nevada. As a matter of fact, it'll mean that we report things earlier, but it also means that there's some challenges in terms of getting that reporting out. So that'd be, if I had to hazard a guess at this moment, that'd kind of be where I would put it if I was asked. But I am mindful that it could come up substantially higher than that or substantially lower than that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeremy. We do have we're getting close to our time, but we've got several questions. Do you have a moment to stay with us just a minute more?
Oh, gosh, me? I am here until you tell me I can go home.
Oh, excellent. Our chairwoman, Janet Uthman, has a question. She says, first of all, hello, Jeremy. We saw negative growth for the first quarter. What's your prediction for Q2 and the impact on interest rates?
Yeah, look, I think we're already in recession. Just to be clear, I said that the entire first quarter, and I will continue to say it here. I think we would be in recession with or without the tariffs or the talk or the change in administration or any of this stuff. And that is because our economy was already peaking as we were in 2024, as you kind of look at it, and consumers had to come back. Again, recession is not a bad thing. A recession is something that is normal and part of the regular cycle that we have in our economy. And we came out of a post pandemic, and people were spending a lot of money and taking, revenge vacations and enjoying themselves at high levels. And let's not forget about the fact that we probably all had someone in our family that we had to send to a Taylor Swift concert, which certainly drove the economy in remarkable ways, right? So, from that standpoint, we sort of see that. Do I believe that the economy is going to come back? I do. But, to Janet's question, I don't think it is necessarily the result of all these things, although this will exacerbate it. But I do believe that that consumers are spending more than they can. Right. And if you spend more than you actually have and the savings rate approaches a negative number, that is not sustainable over the long term. And look, Mary Beth, about, I don't know, a month or so ago, we had a water outage at our house. Right. And when the guy came to fix the water, he went out to the road and he turned the water off at the road. And we had to live without water for about 3 days. Look, and I got a teenager, and you don't want a teenager that doesn't be able to take a shower, and you have the dishes are, stacking up, and it's just super uncomfortable. Right. But then, you fix the plumbing and you turn the water back on and everything sort of goes back to normal. And look, I want to believe that what folks are trying to do in Washington, D.C. is identify where there are problems. You turn off the water first, you identify those problems, and you turn it back on, and things get back to something that's a little more normal. I don't know whether the way that it's coming out is sort of that way, but right now the uncertainty that comes while some of the water is being turned off is a little challenging overall. Not a little challenging, it's challenging across the board. And so we kind of need to see how all of this plays out to determine whether, to Janet's question, whether the downturn and some of the challenges are going to last longer, whether they're going to be shorter, depending on what we need to do to sort of right the ship for us overall. But I will tell you that I think, and we said publicly a year ago that we thought the sustainability of the level of growth that we were having was unlikely, and that will mean that we're going to have to go into recession because we need to get to a stabilized level of spending. And by the way, that stabilized level of spending should be at the government level, at the household level, and at the business level, all three of which we have seen some exuberance that probably needs to be tempered a bit.
The exuberance of spending. Great comment.
Thank you.
Jeremy, there's a question about proposals to bring international sports to town, but there's been a bit of reticence to back those efforts. Do you think that kind of thing would help the economy?
I do. Look, I think that, and I realize I tend to be an optimist, so take this for what it's worth. I think if you bring international sports to Las Vegas, that they will do better than they would anywhere else, particularly in the United States. I just do. And I think, with the work that Sarah and her team are doing on things like Brightline, giving us greater connections to Southern California, the fact that, airlines continue to be remarkably creative in terms of expanding airlift into Southern Nevada only creates a greater opportunity in this regard, right? I think that the way in which you perfect it is remarkably important. I think it has to be executed properly, as you saw from that tail of the tape that I showed you before. It's not like just because you open your doors in Las Vegas, it works. But what we do know is a good idea that delivers on the experience, has a rational market, and makes sure that it creates an opportunity, not just to bring people here, but to bring them here for different reasons. I think the opportunity for that is greater today than it ever has been before. I've had folks come in and talk to me. Look, and I think when you look at how successful the rugby event was at Allegiant Stadium, had the opportunity to attend that and see some of the economics underlying that. Right. I mean, the fact that we had tens of thousands of Australians getting on planes and coming to Las Vegas. I mean, they are a rowdy bunch, but they know how to party, and look, and Las Vegas is pretty great, right? I mean, Las Vegas is pretty great. We know the party's not over until the last rugby player goes home. And that is exactly what we delivered. And they did too. Look, Hugh, look at WWE. I mean, you want to talk about this city turning itself upside down for something that people told me. I had people told me, oh, that'll never work in Las Vegas. That they'd say all the time. Awesome. Absolutely awesome. And on Easter weekend, right? A weekend that traditionally is relatively light relative to that, right? Major events work here. You've got one, you can position it appropriately. I think I like your chances.
Yeah, 19 hours on a plane is a commitment.
Damn right. And I like it.
All right, another question. We have just a few more here, Jeremy. Thank you for bearing with us. Kara Kelly, my predecessor. Hey, Kara, thanks for joining us today. She says, based on your response to Erica, she's saying that several of your reflections have been in place or in motion for years. Can you share your candid perspective on what still needs to be done by business leaders here in Nevada? Southern.
Look, this is going to sound like a shameless sort of thing to do, but I think involvement is what matters. I've said it before, I'll say it here. My biggest concern relative to this community is complacency, right? That we're going to allow it happen without the voice of businesses and and consumers and stakeholders being heard or being addressed. And the chamber is on the forefront of that. I think the work that Paul does in Carson City, he is the person that I would call if I had a question relative to what was happening, because he's that good, that informed, and that plugged in relative to what's happening. And I don't think there is anyone that is better in that regard. From that standpoint, I really do worry about the fact that we could be the first generation in modern history to do better than our parents and better than our children. And that scares me to death. And I think as we look at it today, it is our responsibility to make sure that we leave this community better than we found it. And I think some of the initiatives that are out there would do the exact opposite of that. So when you ask me what do businesses have to do, I think the great work that was done by Kara Kelly before you, the great work that is being done by you now is very important work for businesses to be involved, be knowledgeable, and let your voice be heard. Because in today's world, when you allow social media chatter to be the thing that drives policy decisions, that is a very, very scary world to live in. And I think it should be for businesses and households alike.
All right. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for your plug for the government affairs team. Paul Muradkin, we agree, he and his team are outstanding, and the chamber arguably wouldn't be where it is without those teammates of ours. So thank you for that. Kara has another a question here, if you have just a minute more. She says, thank you for your reliable, upbeat perspective on Southern Nevada's economy. For decades, our community's leaders have worked on economic diversification. Certainly, the hospitality and entertainment industry has done a fantastic job on diversification. Can you please comment on how Southern Nevada is doing to achieve industry diversity, economic diversification, and expansion in real numbers? In my mind, Jeremy, that leads to the lands question.
Yeah, I suppose so. I think it's more complicated than that. I mean, look, I think economic development is a lot different than it was before, right? I mean, we have among the best water managers, if not the best water manager anywhere in the United States, but water still remains an issue for us. And I think the chilling effect associated with that around the country in terms of drought and what's going to happen with the river and all those type of things is important. We have return flow credits, so that helps us. We are running out of developable land, and we have this push-pull between a lands bill, which is being brought by Senator Masto, but the ability to get that through a Republican-controlled Congress is difficult. We have the governor that has worked on an MOU with the BLM in terms of land releases, and I think that there's a concerted effort to make that happen. We have a push-pull up at the legislature between a supply-side solution to the housing challenges that we're dealing with and things like rent control or inclusionary zoning, which I think is a very different approach in terms of what we're looking at in that regard. When we think about how all of these things sort of come together, I think we have to recognize that our community's ability to be as attractive as we were from an economic development and economic diversification standpoint is diminished in some ways from where it was a decade ago. And we have to do a lot to make sure that we are protecting the pro-business, pro-development, pro-economic diversification status we have here. We all know, we've seen it in terms of their different points of view relative to whether economic development and diversification are a good for the state of Nevada. And Mary Beth, I fear that that could be a bigger issue over the next 10 years, and I'll get to that in just a moment. I do want to make sure that it's clear here that I think that there's a difference between economic development and economic diversification. I view economic diversification as bringing in a new industry into Southern Nevada, things like like we're talking about in terms of the movie studio, but I believe that economic development, for example, has everything to do with helping the 80,000 businesses, employer businesses that are here in Southern Nevada continue to grow and expand. Our best opportunity for economic growth is not the next business that moves in. It is ensuring that the businesses that are here have an environment and a landscape and that they can continue to grow and develop and invest in their own businesses. That's our greatest opportunity. And I think sometimes that's lost in terms of where we are overall. Now, I do think that there's a growing sentiment that the chamber and others ought to consider, and that is people wanting to close the door behind them. Hey, look, I can't build a pool larger than 600 square feet because we have to preserve water for the next development to take place. I have to take the grass out of my neighborhood so that we can preserve water so the next business can move in and use that water, right? Things like that. My schools are overcrowded. By the way, they were overcrowded long before the last person moved in, or, and I've even heard it with regard to traffic. Gosh, look how busy the 215 is now. What are we doing letting the next person move in? Mary Beth, I have real concerns that the dialogue around that is going to shift and that people are going to want to say, do we really want to grow? And I think this dialogue around whether we want to be a community of 3 million people or 5 million people or 10 million people is a dialogue that is going to require both partnership and leadership to start having a very frank conversation about where we want to be 10 years from now or 20 years from now, because I think maybe the sentiment around that is changing significantly.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Hugh, did you have any final thoughts or questions for Jeremy as we close out our time? We're over.
No, I just want to thank Jeremy again for being here and being the vaccination and the inoculation we need for negativity, and recognizing and talking direct that recessions are not necessarily bad. It's like a good forest fire in nature. It cleans out the underbrush for further growth in the future. And we just have to get through the current time. So thank you, Jeremy. Much appreciated.
Thank you both. I'm so honored to be here, and it's great to be among friends.
Well, Jeremy, you've just been such a great friend to not only the chamber, but to me personally. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. We call you and you're there, and it just means the world. So thank you for your continued commitment to Nevada and our business community, and to making this a better place to live, work, and play. Your expertise is just invaluable. So we appreciate you.
Well, thank you, Mary Beth. It's good to see you. And again, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here.
All right. And thanks again to all of our attendees today. We appreciate you being with us as well. We look forward to the next Situation Report webinar in 2 weeks. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today's Vegas Chamber webinar. Stay engaged, stay informed, and we'll see you at the next Vegas Chamber event.